They don't always leave loudly, but the real damage often happens when they come back, and nothing inside you is the same anymore. One of the most risky moments in an avoidant relationship is not when they walk away, but when they come back. Because by the time an avoidant reappears, the emotional impact has already quietly settled inside you. The sleepless nights have already happened. The confusion has already happened. The overthinking, the self-doubt, the constant questioning of what went wrong. All of that has already taken place. You find yourself stuck on one thought without even noticing it building in the background. Will they return? And what makes avoidant dynamics so complicated is that they often do come back. Sometimes it's a simple message. Sometimes it's a reaction to a story, a small excuse to reconnect, or a casual check-in that feels harmless on the surface. But emotionally, it can shake everything inside you. Because the moment they return, all the unresolved emotion gets triggered again. Hope comes back quickly. The nervous system reacts before logic does, and many people fall right back into the same pattern without even realizing it. They respond too fast, open up too easily, and restore emotional access to someone who hasn't shown any real change. And in that instant, the old cycle quietly resets. Closeness, distance, confusion, return, emotional collapse again. This happens because most people are never taught how to handle the moment an avoidant comes back. There is a lot of advice about getting them back, but very little about what to do after they return. Yet that is where everything is actually decided. At that stage, it is no longer just about them. It is about you. About whether your pain turned into growth or into emotional dependency. About whether loneliness weakened you or forced you to build inner strength. About whether you rebuilt your emotional identity or still place your center of peace in someone who keeps disappearing. Avoidant individuals often return when the emotional pressure around them feels lighter. Not because they suddenly became fully secure, but because your energy feels less demanding to their nervous system. Less emotional weight, less tension, more space. And this is where most people make a serious mistake. The moment the avoidant returns, they abandon their progress. They confuse reconnection with transformation. Just because someone comes back does not mean they have changed deeply. Sometimes they return before understanding their own emotional patterns. That is why emotional self-respect becomes critical here. Not punishment, not cold revenge, not emotional games, but clear boundaries, calm awareness, and steady emotional control. Because how you respond when they return decides whether the cycle repeats or finally breaks. There is something else most people don't notice. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional energy beneath words. They can feel desperation even when you sound calm. They can sense dependency even when you act composed. They notice when your life still quietly revolves around them. That is why forced detachment never really works. Emotional performance eventually cracks. But real inner change is different. It naturally changes your tone, your timing, your reactions, and your overall presence. And avoidants feel that shift immediately. Suddenly they are not interacting with the same emotionally available version of you they once expected. That creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is what often pulls their attention back in. Not because they want drama, but because the emotional pattern they were used to is no longer there. That's when curiosity begins to return. Not because everything is healed, but because predictability has disappeared. And this is where emotional control becomes more powerful than emotional reaction. Calm boundaries create more impact than chasing ever could. Because chasing reinforces the old dynamic, while emotional steadiness rewrites it. There is also a deeper truth behind avoidant behavior. They often experience a conflict between wanting closeness and fearing emotional restriction at the same time. One part of them wants connection. Another part fears losing independence inside that connection. This internal push and pull creates confusing behavior, especially when they return acting softer or more open than before. Sometimes that softness is real growth. Sometimes it is temporary relief. And understanding the difference is what protects you from repeating the same emotional cycle for years. By the end of this understanding, one thing becomes clear. Emotional control matters far more than emotional reaction when an avoidant comes back. Peaceful boundaries have more power than emotional chasing, and the strongest position you can hold is not emotional punishment, but self-respect that protects your inner stability no matter who returns. This is Avoidant Decoded, where we explore deep relationship psychology, emotional patterns, attachment behavior, and the hidden dynamics people usually miss. And one final thing to understand is this. Avoidants often process emotions differently. When separation happens, they don't immediately feel loss. At first, they feel relief. Relief from emotional intensity, relief from expectations, relief from pressure. That is why they may appear calm or detached after distance. But that does not mean they feel nothing. It means their emotional processing is delayed and often suppressed in order to maintain control. And distance becomes their way of regulating internal overwhelm, at least for a while. Because avoidant individuals are often deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability, emotional separation can initially feel safer to them than closeness itself. That short-term sense of relief is exactly what confuses so many people, because it can look like they never cared at all. But emotional suppression is not emotional absence. A lot of avoidants don't process feelings in real time. Instead, they push emotions aside, distract themselves, stay occupied with routines, and avoid sitting with anything that feels too intense internally. So the emotional weight doesn't disappear, it gets delayed. And that's where the contradiction begins. When emotional pressure is high during connection, their nervous system focuses on escape. But when things finally become quiet, that same nervous system is no longer in defense mode. And in that quieter space, unresolved attachment starts to surface on its own. Memories come back. Emotional distance starts to feel more noticeable. Curiosity increases. Sometimes guilt appears. Sometimes longing shows up. Not because they suddenly transformed, but because they are no longer actively suppressing everything at once. This is why avoidants often feel emotions most strongly after the distance has already settled. When chasing stops, expectations drop, and emotional pressure fades, they finally have enough internal space to feel what they avoided earlier. And in many cases, that delayed emotional processing becomes the exact trigger that makes them reach out again. This is where things usually go wrong. After weeks or months of emotional confusion, the nervous system is already worn down. So when contact happens again, relief takes over instantly. The loneliness feels like it might finally end. The uncertainty softens for a moment. And because of that emotional release, many people open up too fast. They respond immediately. They reconnect emotionally overnight. The boundaries they slowly built during separation weaken in an instant. And without realizing it, they step right back into the same emotional pattern that existed before. From the avoidance side, this creates something very familiar. Emotional access is available again without resistance. And that changes everything. Because when reconnection happens too quickly, the avoidant doesn't experience any real emotional consequence of the distance. The relationship becomes safe again before anything meaningful is understood or addressed. And when emotional safety returns too early, accountability often never fully develops. This is why instant forgiveness can quietly undo emotional progress. Not because forgiveness is wrong, but because patterns repeat when nothing actually shifts underneath the surface. A lot of people confuse reconnection with healing. But an avoidant coming back doesn't always mean growth has happened. Sometimes it's just emotional familiarity. Sometimes it's loneliness. Sometimes it's temporary emotional relief after internal pressure drops. But if access is reopened immediately without any emotional boundaries, the same cycle can restart almost automatically. That's why emotional self-control matters so much at this stage. Not emotional punishment, not cold games, but grounded emotional awareness. Because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional energy beneath words. They can feel desperation even when you sound calm. They can sense dependency even when you try to appear composed. And if they notice that your emotional world is still centered around them, the dynamic quietly shifts back to the old pattern. Predictability returns. And when things become predictable again, emotional urgency fades. At that point, the avoidant subconsciously feels a familiar sense of control over the connection again, even if nobody says it out loud. A common misunderstanding is that dealing with an avoidant means becoming cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable as a form of revenge. But bitterness and self-respect are not the same state of mind. Bitterness still stays emotionally attached to pain. It still wants a reaction. It still looks for validation through the other person's guilt or awareness. Even when it looks like strength on the outside, it is still emotionally tied to the same person. And avoidants can usually sense that intensity very quickly. Because emotional charge, even in anger, still keeps the bond active. Emotional self-respect feels different. It is steady. It is calm. It doesn't rely on emotional reactions to feel powerful. It doesn't need punishment to feel justified. And it doesn't revolve around forcing someone else to understand your pain. That kind of emotional stability changes everything in an avoidant dynamic. Because instead of emotional pressure, they feel emotional clarity. Instead of chaos, they encounter consistency. Instead of reactivity, they face grounded boundaries. And that is often far more impactful than anger ever could be. Because real self-respect is no longer waiting for validation from the person who hurt you. It slowly brings your emotional center back to yourself. That is the deeper shift avoidant individuals often notice without fully understanding it in the moment. The emotional desperation is no longer there. The chasing is gone. The instability that once surrounded the connection has disappeared. And now, they are not dealing with someone who is trying to win them back at any cost or punish them for leaving. They are dealing with someone who has finally learned how to protect their peace without turning pain into emotional revenge or proving their worth through reaction. What many people misunderstand is that avoidant individuals are not simply disconnected or indifferent. In most cases, emotional closeness itself can feel overwhelming for their nervous system, especially when it starts to feel too intense, too constant, or too demanding. And when emotional pressure builds up, their instinct is not to lean in. It is to pull away in order to regain internal balance. This is why emotional chasing rarely creates the result people expect. The more someone pursues, explains, or seeks constant reassurance, the more emotionally heavy the connection can feel for the avoidant. What one person experiences as love and urgency, the other may experience as pressure and emotional overload. When that happens, withdrawal becomes a form of self-regulation, not necessarily rejection of the person, but escape from emotional intensity they feel they cannot comfortably hold. This is where calm emotional stability completely changes the dynamic. Stability does not feel like pressure. It does not feel like chaos. It does not feel like emotional demand. Instead, it creates space. And in that space, the avoidant nervous system is no longer constantly preparing for emotional overwhelm. Your energy becomes grounded, steady, and less reactive. And even if they cannot explain it logically, they feel that difference immediately. Because calmness does something emotional intensity cannot. It removes the feeling of being emotionally cornered. The avoidant is no longer responsible for constantly managing someone else's emotional state. And in that absence of pressure, something unexpected often happens. Curiosity begins to replace resistance. This is why emotionally stable individuals often have a deeper long-term effect on avoidant dynamics than emotionally intense ones. Stability creates psychological safety. It introduces balance instead of volatility. And over time, that changes how the connection is experienced internally. But one of the most overlooked traps in avoidant reconnection is what happens inside the other person. After an avoidant returns, many people are not truly reconnecting from emotional clarity. They are reconnecting from a need to finally feel chosen. On the surface, it looks like love or second chances, but underneath, it is often emotional repair, trying to heal the wound of being left behind. They want proof that they mattered, proof that the avoidant came back because they were valuable, proof that the waiting, confusion, and pain meant something. Without realizing it, the reconnection becomes centered around emotional validation rather than emotional wholeness. And that is where dependency starts rebuilding itself again. Every message feels significant. Every reply carries emotional weight. Every small sign of attention feels like relief. And the avoidant often senses this shift beneath the surface more clearly than words suggest, because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional need directed toward them. Even when someone appears composed externally, the underlying emotional energy often reveals the truth of attachment. When that energy is still rooted in fear of loss or emotional hunger, the avoidant begins to feel it again, and the same pattern slowly reactivates. The emotional weight returns, the expectations return, the pressure returns, and eventually the familiar instinct to withdraw can reappear. Many people assume the goal is to win the avoidant back. But when reconnection becomes centered around being chosen, validated, or emotionally confirmed by them, the balance of the relationship shifts again. Now your emotional stability depends on their behavior. And that creates fear underneath the surface. Fear of losing them again, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment returning. And avoidants often sense that fear long before it is ever spoken, because reconnection built on emotional need carries a completely different energy than reconnection built on emotional wholeness. One feels dependent, the other feels grounded. And the nervous system reacts to those differences instinctively. Rejecting or responding to an avoidant in a healthy way is not about becoming cold, distant, or emotionally punishing. It is not about using silence as revenge or creating emotional confusion on purpose. Real emotional strength is much quieter than that. It shows up as calmness. It shows up as grounded behavior. It shows up in the ability to stay centered even when old emotional triggers are activated again. Most people assume emotional intensity creates impact, but with avoidant dynamics, emotional intensity often creates overwhelm instead. Calm energy, on the other hand, creates clarity. Because calmness removes urgency, it removes panic. It removes the feeling that emotional access is instantly available on demand. And that is where emotional neutrality becomes powerful. Not emotional coldness, not suppression, not pretending not to care, but emotional control, being able to care without collapsing into old patterns again. Avoidants notice this shift quickly. They can feel when someone is no longer reacting from dependency. The emotional pressure is gone. The chasing is gone. And suddenly, the connection feels unfamiliar in a new way. There is more space, more balance, more uncertainty. And that uncertainty is what often changes their attention. Because now your emotional world is no longer fully predictable or fully available on demand. And that quietly shifts the entire dynamic. Avoidants often return expecting things to feel the same as before. Even after time and distance, there is often an unconscious assumption that emotional access will still be there exactly as it was. So they test it, subtly, through timing, availability, responses, and emotional tone. And when they find that things are no longer automatic, something shifts internally. Not because of games or manipulation, but because emotional certainty is no longer guaranteed. And emotional certainty is what used to define the old cycle. Now it has been interrupted, not through punishment, but through consistency. Your emotional energy no longer collapses the moment they reappear. Your standards remain intact. Your self-respect remains steady. And because of that, they experience you differently than before. Suddenly, emotional access no longer feels automatic. The avoidant begins to notice that your emotional world is no longer shaped around their timing, their uncertainty, or their inconsistency. And that shift quietly changes the entire emotional balance of the connection, because boundaries always communicate something deeper than words ever can. They communicate self-worth. Not arrogance, not emotional distance for the sake of it, but a steady sense of self-respect. Many avoidant individuals are used to patterns where distance is eventually followed by easy reconnection, almost like nothing changed. But when someone stays calm, consistent, and emotionally grounded over time, that familiar pattern stops working the same way. And slowly, the avoidant nervous system starts registering a different reality. They begin to sense that closeness is no longer automatic, that emotional access is no longer guaranteed, that connection now requires stability, awareness, and emotional maturity instead of convenience or impulse. This is where something like delayed respect can begin to form. Not immediately, and not always consciously. Avoidants rarely process emotional shifts in real time. But consistency has a slow effect. It reshapes perception over time. Your calmness starts to feel different. Your grounded responses feel different. Your emotional independence becomes noticeable in a way that words cannot fully explain. And gradually, they realize they are no longer interacting with the same version of you that once accepted inconsistency without limits. That realization quietly shifts the emotional dynamic, because self-respect naturally changes how others experience your presence. At this stage, one of the most powerful responses is no longer trying to convince the avoidant to stay, explain themselves, or finally understand what they caused. It is recognizing that you no longer need to fight emotionally for the connection. This is often difficult because emotional pain creates a strong desire for resolution. People want closure. They want validation. They want the other person to finally understand the impact of their absence. But real change often begins when the need to win emotionally disappears. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because your identity is no longer built around whether they choose you or not. And that shift changes everything internally. The healthiest form of emotional separation is rarely dramatic. It does not need emotional speeches or reactions. It does not need punishment or performances to prove strength. Real emotional freedom is quieter than that. It shows up as calm acceptance, clear boundaries, and the ability to stop trying to control how someone perceives you. Instead of collapsing into anger or obsession, you begin protecting your peace with clarity. No revenge, no emotional warfare. No need to force understanding from someone who is not emotionally equipped to give it. Just detachment rooted in self-respect. And ironically, this kind of emotional freedom often impacts avoidance more deeply than intensity ever could. Because they are used to pursuit, used to reactions, used to emotional energy constantly revolving around their inconsistency. But calm detachment feels unfamiliar. It removes predictability. It removes emotional control. It removes the expectation that your attention will always be available whenever they return. And suddenly, they are no longer interacting with someone whose emotional world bends around them. Instead, they are faced with someone who feels self-contained, lighter, more grounded, no longer reaching outward for emotional stability. And many avoidants remember that shift long after the dynamic changes, not because of punishment, but because your absence no longer feels emotionally accessible in the same way. There is no chasing left, no emotional urgency left to reassure them. Just the realization that the person who once waited emotionally has learned how to move forward without needing permission or closure from them. In the end, the real transformation was never about revenge or emotional payback. It was never about making the other person feel what you felt, or forcing them to finally understand your pain, because that path often keeps people emotionally tied to the same cycle for much longer than they realize. Even anger can become a form of attachment when your emotional energy still revolves around someone who hurt you. Real change begins when you stop abandoning yourself for connection. When you stop shrinking your needs, your peace, and your self-worth just to keep access to someone inconsistent. Because in avoidant dynamics, people often lose themselves slowly without noticing it. Their emotional state becomes tied to another person's availability. Their peace depends on another person's response. Their self-worth starts to rise and fall with attention. But when that dependency breaks, something stabilizes internally. Your emotions become calmer. Your identity becomes more centered. Your reactions are no longer controlled by uncertainty. And that emotional independence creates a quiet form of power that avoidants tend to remember long after the relationship ends. Not because you became cold, not because you punished them, but because your emotional freedom feels completely different from emotional attachment. It feels grounded. It feels complete within itself. And sometimes, when an avoidant realizes they can no longer access that emotional pull they once depended on, they begin to understand the loss they avoided facing earlier. That is the irony of these dynamics. The less you chase emotional validation, the stronger your presence becomes. Because people who are emotionally whole do not need to force importance. Their calmness communicates it. Their boundaries communicate it. Their energy communicates it. And in the end, whether the avoidant returns or not becomes less important than the fact that you finally return to yourself. And remember, the strongest form of power is not control over someone else. It is control over your own emotional world. And the moment you master that, you are no longer waiting for anyone to choose you. You are finally choosing yourself, completely and without hesitation.